Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. Before Canada officially became a country in 1867, its land had already witnessed centuries of rich, complex history, much of it overlooked in mainstream narratives. Long before European contact, diverse Indigenous nations thrived across the continent. From the Haida in the Pacific Northwest to the Mi'kmaq in the east and the Cree and Dene in the Central Territories, these communities had their own systems of governance, trade networks, and spiritual traditions. The land was not empty or uncivilized. It was alive with culture, knowledge, and identity. In the early 1600s, French explorers and fur traders entered the scene, seeking fortune through the fur trade. They formed crucial alliances with indigenous groups like the Huron-Wendat, relying on them for survival and guidance through the vast wilderness. These relationships were not always peaceful. Rivalries flared, and conflicts with the powerful Haudenosaunee Confederacy reshaped the region's political landscape. Meanwhile, the British pushed in from the Atlantic, leading to a centuries-long struggle for control between France and Britain. Their battles didn't just play out on European soil. They were fought right here, in the forests and rivers of North America, dragging indigenous nations into brutal wars not of their making. As European powers clashed, indigenous peoples navigated an increasingly volatile world, balancing diplomacy and resistance to protect their lands and cultures. The British eventually claimed dominance after the fall of New France in 1763, but the path to Confederation was still far from simple. The story of Canada's formation is not just a tale of political meetings and signatures. It's a story of resistance, survival, and voices that were nearly erased. These are the stories they don't teach in school. This is the hidden history of Canada. Long before European settlers arrived, the land we now call Canada was home to vibrant and highly developed Indigenous nations. These weren't scattered or primitive tribes. They were complex societies, with deep-rooted traditions, governance systems, and economies adapted to the land they had lived on for thousands of years. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, often known as the Iroquois, formed a powerful political and military alliance of several nations, governed by a sophisticated system of checks and balances that some scholars believe influenced later democratic ideas. The Cree, spread across the vast boreal forests and plains, had extensive trade routes and relied on their deep understanding of the land to survive and thrive. The Mi'kmaq of the eastern woodlands were expert navigators of both land and sea, living in harmony with the tides and seasons along the Atlantic coast. To the north, the Inuit people lived in some of the harshest conditions on Earth, adapting to the Arctic environment with incredible ingenuity. Their tools, hunting techniques, and knowledge of ice and wildlife were passed down through generations, ensuring survival where few others could endure. The Métis people, emerging from the union of Indigenous women and European fur traders, formed a unique culture and identity rooted in both traditions, playing a key role in the fur trade and the shaping of Canada's early frontier history. Oral storytelling was central to all these cultures, not just as entertainment, but as a way to preserve law, morality, memory, and identity. These oral histories were encyclopedias of cultural wisdom, passed from elder to youth with precision and reverence. The geography of the land played a vital role in shaping how people lived, moved, and interacted. Canada's vast rivers were not barriers, but highways. The St. Lawrence River served as a vital artery for travel, trade, and communication, long before it became a route for European explorers. It linked the Great Lakes with the Atlantic and was surrounded by fertile lands and dense forests rich in wildlife. Hudson Bay, with its massive coastline and frozen reaches, became a central hub for trade, drawing Indigenous groups together for seasonal exchanges. The Rocky Mountains, with their towering peaks and hidden valleys, not only acted as a formidable natural boundary, but also housed Indigenous communities who had adapted to the alpine environment over countless generations. This deep relationship between people and the land was reflected in every aspect of daily life. Seasonal migrations were not random, but carefully timed events based on generations of observation and experience. In coastal areas, communities harvested fish, seals, and shellfish in harmony with the tides and breeding cycles. In the forests, knowledge of plant life was incredibly advanced. Every tree, root, and berry had a purpose, whether for food, healing, or ceremony. Tools were crafted with precision, using materials sourced respectfully from the environment, and nothing was wasted. Hunting was guided by a spiritual code that emphasized gratitude and balance, often accompanied by rituals that honored the animals for their sacrifice. Territory wasn't defined by fences or ownership in the European sense. It was based on relationships, kinship ties, and mutual stewardship. Trade routes connected communities across vast distances, creating a network of exchange not only of goods like furs, copper, and dried fish, but also of stories, languages, and technologies. The land and waters were the threads that held it all together. Every mountain, river, and tree had a story attached, and those stories weren't just myths. They were maps of memory, guiding people across generations. This wasn't a wilderness, waiting to be discovered. It was a living, breathing homeland, shaped by human hands in partnership with nature. And for those who lived here long before colonization, the land wasn't just where life happened, it was life itself. Around the year 1000 CE, centuries before Columbus set sail or the French and British laid their claims, Norse explorers led by Leif Erikson made their way across the Atlantic from Greenland. Landing on the northern tip of what is now Newfoundland, they established a small settlement at a site we now call L'Anse aux Meadows. This settlement, confirmed by archaeological evidence, marks the earliest known European presence in North America. But their stay was brief. The Norse, unfamiliar with the land and its peoples, struggled to sustain their outpost. Conflicts with indigenous groups, whom they called Skraelings, and the challenges of isolation ultimately led them to abandon Vinland, leaving behind little more than traces in the soil and stories passed down in Icelandic sagas. Over 5 centuries later, in 1534, French explorer Jacques Cartier arrived in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, planting a cross and claiming the land for France. He met with the St. Lawrence Iroquoians, recorded some of their words, and even took a few individuals back to France. But his journeys were driven by a familiar European goal: finding wealth, trade routes, and resources. Though he explored parts of what would become Quebec, permanent settlement didn't begin until 1608, when Samuel de Champlain founded Quebec City. Champlain, often called the father of New France, didn't just bring settlers, he brought strategy. Recognizing the power and knowledge of indigenous peoples, he formed alliances, particularly with the Huron-Wendat, offering military support against their rivals, the Haudenosaunee. These early relationships between European settlers and indigenous nations were complex and deeply strategic. They were not simply based on the need for food or protection. There was a deeper layer of political and economic ambition. The French didn't come just to explore, they came to profit, especially from the booming fur trade. In Europe, beaver pelts were in high demand for making fashionable hats and garments. Since the French didn't know how to navigate the vast interior lands or trap effectively in the Canadian wilderness, they relied heavily on indigenous partners who had generations of experience hunting and traveling these regions. Indigenous groups, in turn, saw opportunities in these alliances. They gained access to European goods like metal tools, firearms, and textiles, which gave them an advantage over rival nations. But this trade also brought unintended consequences. With guns now in the hands of certain tribes, traditional power, balances shifted, and conflicts that had once been fought with bows and spears became far deadlier. Long-standing rivalries escalated into larger, more destructive wars. The Europeans, whether intentionally or not, became deeply involved in these indigenous struggles, often picking sides to protect their trading routes or settlements. While the French built relationships with groups like the Huron-Wendat, the British were doing the same on the other side of the continent, especially with the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. These competing alliances mirrored the political tensions brewing in Europe. As each European power carved out its stake in the land, indigenous nations found themselves caught in an increasingly dangerous game, sometimes benefiting, sometimes suffering. The idea of first contact might suggest a single moment in history, but in reality, it was a long and ongoing process. Each encounter between Europeans and indigenous peoples brought new consequences. There were moments of cooperation and mutual respect, but also periods of betrayal, disease, violence, and cultural loss. It was through this tangled web of relationships that the foundations of modern Canada began to form, not as a peaceful meeting of cultures, but as a contested, evolving space shaped by power, trade, and survival. As European interest in North America grew, the fur trade became the beating heart of colonization. two powerful companies emerged, turning the wilderness into a battleground of commerce and control: the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company. Founded in 1670, the Hudson's Bay Company was granted an enormous monopoly by the British Crown, giving it control over the entire Hudson Bay watershed, known as Rupert's Land. It operated primarily from trading posts near the bay, where Indigenous trappers would bring furs in exchange for European goods. On the other side was the Northwest Company, formed later by ambitious merchants based in Montreal. They took a more aggressive, mobile approach, sending voyageurs, rugged French-Canadian paddlers, deep into the interior to trade directly with Indigenous communities. These two companies weren't just competitors, they represented two entirely different strategies. The Hudson's Bay Company relied on Indigenous peoples to travel to them, while the Northwest Company went to the people. This created fierce competition not only for furs, but for Indigenous alliances. Both companies knew that maintaining good relationships with Indigenous nations was essential for survival and profit. As a result, Indigenous partners became central players in the fur economy, not just as suppliers, but as negotiators, guides, and cultural intermediaries. Trade routes stretched thousands of kilometers, crisscrossing rivers and lakes, connecting remote forests to global markets. At the same time, the broader rivalry between France and Britain was playing out on the same land. The French had claimed Acadia and Quebec, building fortified settlements and forming strong military alliances with Indigenous nations, like the Mi'kmaq and the Huron-Wendat. The British, meanwhile, were expanding along the Atlantic seaboard and forming their own strategic relationships, especially with the Haudenosaunee. Tensions over land, trade routes, and influence kept rising until they exploded into full-scale war. The 7 Years' War, fought from 1756 to 1763. This was not just a European war. It was a North American conflict too, known locally as the French and Indian War. Indigenous nations were deeply involved, many fighting alongside their French or British allies, hoping to protect their own interests and territories. The war devastated communities, disrupted trade, and led to widespread suffering. In the end, Britain emerged victorious. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1763, marked the official transfer of New France to British control. Quebec, Acadia, and much of eastern Canada were now part of the British Empire. This shift wasn't just about flags changing on maps. It marked the beginning of a new era of colonial rule, one that would bring new pressures on Indigenous lands, cultures, and autonomy. The fur trade would continue, but under a different system of power, setting the stage for the future conflicts and transformations that would define Canadian history. After the British took control of New France in 1763, they faced a major challenge: how to govern a colony where the majority of the population was still French-speaking, Catholic, and culturally distinct from the British settlers. To manage this delicate balance, the British Parliament passed the Quebec Act in 1774. This law allowed French Canadians to continue practicing Catholicism and restored French civil law alongside British criminal law. It also recognized the rights of the Catholic Church and allowed the seigneurs, French landowners, to maintain their feudal system of landholding. For the French population, the act was a rare moment of cultural respect and legal recognition under a foreign empire. It helped preserve their language, religion, and identity in a changing world. But for many British settlers, especially the Protestant English-speaking newcomers, the Quebec Act was seen as a betrayal. They resented the special status given to Catholics and feared that this tolerance would undermine British values and Protestant dominance. These tensions laid the groundwork for future friction between the two linguistic and cultural groups in Canada, tensions that still echo today. Then came the American Revolution, which drastically reshaped the population and politics of British North America. As the 13 colonies fought for independence, not all residents supported the revolution. Those who remained loyal to the British Crown, known as the United Empire Loyalists, faced persecution and violence. Tens of thousands fled north, seeking refuge in British-controlled territories. Many settled in Nova Scotia and newly created colonies like New Brunswick and Upper Canada, present-day Ontario. These loyalists brought with them a strong sense of British identity, Protestant faith, and a desire for political stability. Their arrival shifted the demographic and cultural balance in Canada, creating a more distinctly English presence in what had been a largely French and Indigenous land. By the early 1800s, however, frustrations were brewing in both Upper and Lower Canada. In Upper Canada, the English-speaking population was tired of a colonial government dominated by a wealthy elite known as the Family Compact. In Lower Canada, the French-speaking majority felt increasingly marginalized by British officials, who held power despite being a cultural minority. Both regions lacked responsible government, meaning that elected assemblies had little real authority, while colonial governors and their appointed councils made most decisions. These frustrations boiled over in 1837 and 1838, as rebellions broke out in both colonies. In Lower Canada, led by Louis-Joseph Papineau and the Patriots, rebels demanded more autonomy, protection of French language and culture, and democratic reforms. In Upper Canada, William Lyon Mackenzie led a smaller but passionate uprising against corruption and elite control. Both rebellions were quickly crushed by British troops, but they sent a powerful message to London. The people of Canada were no longer willing to be ruled without a voice. The rebellions of 1837-38 were more than just short-lived uprisings. They were a wake-up call to the British Empire that the status quo in Canada was unsustainable. Colonists in both Upper and Lower Canada had long felt ignored and powerless under a system that gave real authority to appointed governors and elites, rather than to the people's elected representatives. This frustration boiled over into open rebellion because many colonists believed that peaceful reform was impossible within the current structure. They weren't just fighting for lower taxes or more land. They were demanding political reform, representation, and the ability to shape their own society. In Lower Canada, where the majority of the population was French-speaking, the rebellion was driven by deep resentment over cultural and linguistic suppression. The British administration had tried to assert control over education, the judiciary, and land, all in ways that threatened French-Canadian traditions and autonomy. Louis-Joseph Papineau and the Patriots wanted to protect their language, culture, and rights through democratic reforms. They saw the rebellion as a struggle for survival against a colonial system designed to assimilate or ignore them. Meanwhile, in Upper Canada, the grievances were different but equally urgent. The English-speaking population was largely governed by a small, powerful circle known as the Family Compact, wealthy conservative elites who controlled government, the church, and the economy. Reformers like William Lyon Mackenzie wanted to break this monopoly and give regular people a voice in how they were governed. Although Mackenzie's actual rebellion was short-lived and poorly organized, it captured a growing dissatisfaction among settlers who believed in the ideals of self-rule and fairness. The British response was swift and harsh, crushing the uprisings and punishing those involved. But rather than dismissing the rebellions as criminal acts, the British government took them as a warning sign. They sent John George Lambton, the Earl of Durham, to investigate the root causes. His findings were blunt and revolutionary. Durham report stated that the colonial system in Canada had failed to evolve with the people's expectations. He famously wrote that 2 nations warring in the bosom of a single state could not stand, referring to the tensions between French and English populations. His solution: unite Upper and Lower Canada to dilute French-Canadian influence and begin the process toward responsible government. Durham's recommendations planted the seeds for a major transformation. While the immediate unification of the two Canadas in 1841 was seen as a step toward assimilation, it also forced British officials to take colonial demands more seriously. Over the next decade, pressure from reformers continued, eventually leading to the introduction of responsible government in the 1840s. For the first time, colonial assemblies began to have real power to make decisions, pass laws, and control budgets, marking a fundamental shift toward democracy. In essence, these rebellions, though defeated militarily, succeeded politically. They forced the British Empire to confront the limitations of colonial rule and opened the door for Canada to begin its journey toward self-government. They were the first signs of a uniquely Canadian political identity forming, rooted in compromise, pluralism, and the idea that government should be by the people, for the people. By the mid-19th century, the scattered British colonies in North America, Canada East, formerly Lower Canada, Canada West, formerly Upper Canada, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and others, were facing growing pressures that made political unity not just desirable, but necessary. These pressures came from both external threats and internal dysfunction, setting the stage for the most important turning point in Canadian history: Confederation. One of the most urgent concerns was the growing power and ambition of the United States. The American Civil War, 1861–1865, had demonstrated just how quickly political disputes could erupt into devastating conflict, and it showed the military might of a country that had grown rapidly in size and population. More worrying still was the ideology of manifest destiny, the belief held by many Americans that the United States was destined to expand across the entire North American continent, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. British colonies to the north looked increasingly vulnerable in the face of this expansionist mindset. There were real fears that, once the Civil War ended, the U.S. might turn its attention toward annexing neighboring British territories. This wasn't just paranoia. There had already been skirmishes, such as the Fenian raids, where Irish-American militants crossed into Canada hoping to pressure Britain into granting Irish independence. The British Empire, still powerful, but stretched thin across the globe, was reluctant to pour resources into defending sparsely populated colonies. That left colonial leaders with a stark choice: unite for mutual defense or remain vulnerable as divided provinces. At the same time, economic forces were driving the colonies toward union. Trade between the provinces was inconsistent, hindered by tariffs, poor infrastructure, and political divisions. The need for a unified trade network was especially pressing as the colonies faced the end of the Reciprocity Treaty with the United States, a trade deal that had allowed Canadian goods into U.S. markets duty-free. When the Americans canceled the treaty in 1866, it sent a clear message: Canada needed to rely on itself. A transcontinental railway, linking the Atlantic provinces to central Canada and eventually to the Western Territories, became a powerful symbol of unity and economic survival. Not only would it allow goods to move more easily, but it would also physically bind the vast territory together, reinforcing the idea of a single nation. Without it, the western regions might drift toward the U.S., and the eastern provinces could remain isolated. But internal political issues also played a big role. In the province of Canada, Canada East and Canada West, French and English politicians were locked in a constant power struggle. The two groups had equal representation in the legislature, which might seem fair, but in practice it led to gridlock. Neither side could push through major reforms without the support of the other, and cooperation was increasingly difficult. Leaders began to see Confederation as a way to escape the deadlock by giving each region its own provincial government, while still creating a strong central federal government. This vision came together at a series of meetings: the Charlottetown Conference, 1864, and the Quebec Conference, 1864, where representatives from various colonies debated and shaped the blueprint of a united Canada. They envisioned a federation that balanced local autonomy with national strength, capable of defending itself, building infrastructure, and creating a more stable political system. By 1867, this vision became a reality. The British North America Act created the Dominion of Canada, uniting Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia under one federal government. It was not yet the Canada we know today, but it was the beginning, a step towards sovereignty, forged from fear, ambition, cooperation, and compromise. The final push to Confederation wasn't driven by idealism alone. It was born from real-world challenges that demanded bold solutions. In uniting, the provinces laid the foundation for a country that would grow, evolve, and eventually emerge as an independent and diverse nation on the global stage. The legacy of pre-Confederation Canada is deeply woven into the fabric of the country's modern identity, complex, layered, and often contradictory. Long before the Dominion of Canada was formed in 1867, the land had been shaped by Indigenous civilizations, European rivalries, cultural fusion, and the struggles for representation and self-governance. These foundational forces did not disappear with Confederation. They continued to define Canada's political institutions, cultural identity, and ongoing debates about nationhood. One of the most profound and often under-acknowledged legacies is the influence of Indigenous governance systems, particularly the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and its Great Law of Peace. This ancient constitution, based on principles of consensus building, shared leadership, and balance of power, inspired early democratic thinkers, including those in the American colonies. The Haudenosaunee, also known as the Iroquois Confederacy, created a political structure that united multiple nations under a sophisticated system of law and diplomacy. This governance model emphasized the importance of communal well-being, environmental stewardship, and intergenerational thinking, values that have resurfaced in modern movements toward reconciliation and sustainable development. Though the British and French colonial systems often dismissed or undermined Indigenous governance, its legacy remains influential, especially as Canada reckons with its colonial past and moves toward meaningful partnerships with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. Another key legacy is the enduring French-English duality that has shaped nearly every aspect of Canadian society. From the moment French explorers like Jacques Cartier and Samuel de Champlain staked claims in the St. Lawrence Valley, the presence of two founding European cultures set Canada apart from its neighbors. The French language, Catholic religion, and civil law traditions were preserved through legal protections such as the Quebec Act of 1774, even after British conquest. Meanwhile, the influx of British settlers, especially following the American Revolution, brought their own institutions, language, and Protestant values. This coexistence has not always been peaceful or equal. There were periods of assimilationist policies, cultural suppression, and political imbalance. Yet over time, the recognition of biculturalism became a defining feature of Canadian identity. The tension between these two linguistic communities eventually led to major developments, such as the Official Languages Act and the recognition of Quebec's unique status within Canada. More than just a practical accommodation, the French-English dynamic has pushed Canada to think differently about identity, not as a single cultural mold, but as a dialogue between cultures. Layered on top of this duality is Canada's multicultural foundation, which began even before Confederation. In addition to French and British settlers, early Canada saw waves of immigration and cultural blending. The Métis Nation, born from unions between Indigenous women and European fur traders, is one of the most powerful symbols of this multicultural genesis. Black loyalists settled in Nova Scotia, Chinese laborers helped build the railways, Irish and Scottish immigrants filled towns across the Maritimes and the prairies. Each of these groups faced their own forms of marginalization, yet each contributed to the evolving Canadian story. What emerges from all this is a modern Canadian identity that is defined not by a single origin, language, or ideology, but by a complex negotiation between many voices. The legacy of pre-Confederation Canada is a reminder that this country was never a blank slate. It was always layered with ancient Indigenous wisdom, colonial ambition, cultural collision, and the relentless pursuit of self-determination. This understanding transforms the way we view Canadian history, not as a straight line beginning with Confederation, but as a long and intricate journey that started thousands of years earlier. The foundations of Canada were built on diverse worldviews, often in conflict, sometimes in collaboration, but always shaping one another. The legacy of Indigenous governance challenges us to rethink democracy and sustainability. The persistence of French-English duality forces us to value coexistence over uniformity. The early waves of multiculturalism remind us that Canada has never been culturally monolithic. It has always been a mosaic. The lessons from pre-Confederation Canada are especially urgent today. As the country grapples with climate change, systemic inequality, and its colonial legacy, it can look to the past not just for historical facts, but for enduring wisdom. Indigenous communities continue to lead in environmental protection and social justice. Language rights remain a pillar of cultural survival and pride, and the old tensions between regional interests and national unity still demand thoughtful negotiation, just as they did in the years leading up to 1867. Ultimately, the story of Canada is not one of sudden invention, but of constant reinvention. Its identity has been, and continues to be, shaped by voices that refuse to be silenced, by peoples who adapted and endured, and by a shared belief that compromise and cooperation can build something lasting. The true legacy of pre-Confederation Canada is that it laid the groundwork for a country that is still learning, still evolving, and still striving to live up to its promise. Before Canada became a nation, it was a vast tapestry of civilizations, rivalries, and ideas that laid the foundation for everything that followed. From the wisdom of Indigenous governance to the brutal competition of European empires, from the fur trade that reshaped entire economies to the political rebellions that demanded representation. This is the side of Canadian history that too often gets left out of textbooks. And yet, it's the part that helps us understand Canada not just as a country, but as a living idea, one shaped by cooperation and conflict, identity and adaptation. So take a moment and ask yourself, what if history had unfolded differently? What if Indigenous alliances had become the backbone of governance? What if the French Empire had held its ground? Or if the rebellions had fully succeeded in reshaping colonial rule? Canada might look and feel very different today. If this made you see Canada's past in a new light, make sure to like, subscribe, and drop a comment with your thoughts or questions. What part of this story surprised you the most? What should we explore next? Coming up next, we peel back the curtain on the Confederation of 1867 and reveal the secret deals, political compromises, and power struggles that shaped the Canada we know today. Who really pulled the strings? You won't want to miss it.